In June of 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in human history hit the beaches of Normandy. Over 150,000 troops crossed the English Channel under the command of Dwight Eisenhower, and when it worked, the men who led that invasion became legends. Eisenhower, Montgomery, Patton. You know their names, you have seen them in movies, you have read their memoirs, but there was another man. A man who had spent 3 years fighting behind closed doors to make sure that invasion happened at exactly the right moment, not a year too early when it would have been a catastrophe, and not a year too late when it might not have mattered. He was the professional head of the entire British Army. He chaired the committee that ran Britain's war strategy. Winston Churchill called him indispensable, and when the time came to decide who would command that invasion force in Normandy, he was the one who had been promised the job. His name was Alan Brooke, and the chances are you have never heard of him. That is not an accident. The way we remember World War II has a lot to do with personality, with speeches, with the kinds of men who look good on camera and write quotable memoirs. Brooke was not that kind of man. He was the kind of man who did the work that made all those camera-ready moments possible, and then watched from behind a desk in London, while other men collected the glory. So how does someone that important become someone that invisible? To understand that, you need to go back decades before the war, to a world that no longer exists. Alan Francis Brooke was born in 1883, and not in Britain. He was born in Bagnères de Bigorre, a small town in the south of France, nestled in the foothills of the Pyrenees. His family were Anglo-Irish gentry with a deep military tradition. The Brookes of Colebrook had been producing soldiers for generations, and young Alan was never really going to do anything else. But there was something unusual about him from the start. He grew up speaking French before English. He spent his childhood roaming the countryside around the Pyrenees, developing a passion for birds and wildlife that would stay with him for the rest of his life. When he eventually arrived at the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, he was not the typical product of the English public school system. He was quieter, more intense, and more observant than most of his peers. He was also, it turned out, brilliant with artillery. This mattered more than you might think. In the early 20th century, the British Army was still in love with cavalry charges and regimental tradition. The cavalry officers were the stars. They had the best social connections, the best postings, the best prospects for advancement. Artillery was considered a technical branch, the kind of thing clever but unglamorous officers went into. It did not carry the same social cachet. It did not get you invited to the right dinners. But Brooke took to it with an almost obsessive precision. He studied trajectories and firing tables the way other officers studied polo handicaps. He understood, even as a young man, that warfare was becoming a mathematical problem rather than a test of individual bravery. And when the First World War began in 1914, that understanding saved lives. By the time the war on the Western Front settled into its grinding stalemate of trenches and barbed wire, artillery had become the dominant force on the battlefield. More men were killed by shellfire than by any other weapon. The war had become an industrial killing machine, and the officers who understood how to use that machine with precision became the most valuable men in the army. Brooke served throughout the war, from the early mobile fighting through the long years in the trenches, and he developed a reputation as one of the most innovative gunners in the British Army. He studied the problems of counter-battery fire, the art of locating and destroying enemy artillery positions before they could destroy yours. He pioneered the use of the creeping barrage, a technique where artillery fire moved forward in precise increments just ahead of advancing infantry, creating a curtain of explosions that kept enemy defenders pinned in their trenches until British soldiers were practically on top of them. Getting this wrong by even a few seconds or a few yards meant killing your own men. Getting it right meant breaking through positions that had held for months. Brooke got it right, over and over again. At the Somme and across the killing fields of the Western Front, he refined his techniques, learning from each engagement, adjusting his methods, building a body of practical knowledge about coordinating massive firepower with infantry movement that very few officers in any army could match. By the end of the First World War, he was one of the most respected artillery officers in the British Army. But here is the thing about being an artillery expert. Nobody writes songs about you. Nobody paints your portrait on a horse. You do not get the glory that comes from leading a cavalry charge or capturing a hill. You get results. And Brooke learned early on that results, not reputation, were what he cared about. That lesson would define everything that came after. The years between the wars were frustrating ones for the British military. Budgets were slashed. The army shrank. Politicians who had seen the carnage of the trenches concluded that the best defense policy was to never fight another war. And they cut military spending accordingly. Officers who had survived the Western Front found themselves competing for a shrinking number of commands in an army that the government seemed determined to starve into irrelevance. Brooke spent these decades steadily climbing the ladder, teaching at staff colleges, commanding units, and studying the evolving nature of warfare with a seriousness that set him apart from many of his peers. While a lot of senior British officers spent the interwar years refighting the last war in their heads, convinced that the next conflict would look like the Somme all over again, Brooke was watching what was happening in Germany. He attended German military exercises as an observer. He saw firsthand the development of armored warfare doctrine, the way the Germans were learning to coordinate tanks, aircraft, and mobile infantry into fast-moving combined arms formations that could punch through defensive lines and exploit the breakthrough before the defenders could react. He understood what modern air power could do to an army caught in the open, and he understood that the next war would not be fought from trenches. When war came again in September of 1939, Brooke was given command of the Second Corps of the British Expeditionary Force in France. And within months, everything fell apart. The German invasion of France in May 1940 was a disaster for the Allies. The French army collapsed faster than anyone had thought possible, and the British Expeditionary Force found itself being pushed toward the coast, with its flanks exposed and its supply lines cut. This is the moment most people know as Dunkirk, the famous evacuation of over 300,000 Allied troops from the beaches of northern France. It has been turned into films, books, and national mythology. The little ships, the spirit of defiance. Churchill's speech about fighting on the beaches. What most people do not know is who actually held the line long enough to make that evacuation possible. Brooke commanded the Second Corps on the left flank of the British retreat. His job was simple to describe and almost impossible to execute. Keep the German forces from overwhelming the evacuation perimeter while hundreds of thousands of men funneled toward the beaches. This was not a glamorous assignment. It meant organizing defensive positions under constant air attack, managing exhausted and demoralized troops, making impossible decisions about which units to sacrifice to buy time for others. It meant looking at a map, knowing that a particular battalion was about to be overrun, and accepting that their destruction was necessary so that 10 times their number could escape. Brooke did it with a cold, precise efficiency that impressed even the German officers who later studied the campaign. His rearguard actions around the Ypres to Comines Canal bought critical hours for the evacuation. He moved units like pieces on a chessboard, plugging gaps, reinforcing weak points, trading space for time, with the kind of calculated ruthlessness that only works when the officer giving the orders genuinely understands the terrain and the enemy. He made it out of Dunkirk. But his war in France was not over. Weeks later, Churchill sent Brooke back across the Channel to take command of the remaining British forces in France, over 150,000 troops who were still south of the Somme. His mission was to keep fighting alongside the French. But when Brooke arrived and assessed the situation on the ground, he realized immediately that the mission was hopeless. The French army was finished. Continuing to fight would mean the destruction of the last significant British forces in Europe. This is where Brooke did something that required a very specific kind of courage. Not the courage of leading a charge, but the courage of telling your political masters that their orders were wrong. He called Churchill directly and told him the truth. The remaining British forces had to be evacuated immediately. Continuing the fight was not bold, it was suicidal. Churchill pushed back. The political pressure to stand with France was enormous, but Brooke held firm, and eventually Churchill relented. The second evacuation, Operation Ariel, pulled over 190,000 Allied troops out of western France. If Brooke had obeyed his original orders, those men would have been lost. The British Army would have been gutted beyond recovery, and the entire trajectory of the war would have changed. That willingness to tell Churchill the hard truth, to argue against the emotional decision in favor of the rational one, was the quality that would define Brooke's most important role. Because in December of 1941, Churchill appointed him Chief of the Imperial General Staff. The CIGS was the professional head of the British Army and the government's principal military advisor. Brooke also became chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee, which meant he was effectively the senior strategic voice in the entire British military establishment. And from that moment on, his war became a very different kind of fight. Brooke's private war diaries, which were published after his death, reveal something that most official histories of the war completely gloss over. Churchill was a strategic menace. That sounds harsh. Churchill is remembered, rightly, as one of the great wartime leaders, a man whose speeches rallied a nation and whose refusal to surrender kept Britain in the fight when almost everyone else had given up. But there is a difference between political leadership and military strategy. Churchill had brilliant political instincts and genuinely terrible strategic ones. He was impulsive, romantic, obsessed with dramatic gestures, and allergic to caution. Brooke's diaries are filled with accounts of late-night meetings at 10 Downing Street or Chequers, where Churchill would propose one wild scheme after another. Invasions of Norway, attacks on the northern tip of Sumatra, operations in the Balkans, landings on this island or that peninsula. These meetings often started after 10 at night and went on until 2 or 3 in the morning, because Churchill liked to work late and expected everyone else to keep up. Brooke would sit there, exhausted, while Churchill paced around the room in his dressing gown, waving a cigar, proposing plans that would have scattered British forces across half the globe. And Brooke had to say no. Not once, not twice, constantly, night after night, week after week, for 3.5 years. This is not the kind of heroism that makes for a good movie. There are no explosions. There are no dramatic speeches. There is just a tired man in uniform sitting in a room at midnight, explaining with barely controlled patience why invading northern Norway in winter would be a catastrophe, or why landing forces in Sumatra without air cover would get thousands of men killed. And then doing it all again the next night, when Churchill came up with something new. Brooke's diaries make clear that this took an enormous emotional toll. He frequently wrote about his exhaustion, his frustration, and his private despair at the scale of what he was trying to manage. There are entries where he wonders whether he can carry on, entries where the weight of the war and the constant battle with Churchill seem almost unbearable. He wrote about meetings where Churchill reduced other officers to silence through sheer force of personality, bullying them into agreeing with plans they knew were wrong. Brooke refused to be bullied, but that refusal came at a cost. After particularly brutal sessions, he would go back to his quarters and write diary entries that crackle with barely suppressed frustration. He would describe Churchill as impossible, exhausting, maddening. And then, the next morning, he would put on his uniform, walk back into the War Office, and do it all over again. He missed his family terribly. His first wife had died in a car accident years before the war, a loss that had devastated him. And his second marriage was a source of deep happiness that the war constantly kept him from. He missed his birds. He missed the quiet mornings in the field with his binoculars. He missed the version of his life where he could simply watch a peregrine falcon hunting over the Hampshire Downs and think about nothing else. But he kept going, because he understood something that very few people around Churchill grasped. Britain could not afford a single major strategic mistake. The country's military resources were finite. Every division, every ship, every aircraft had to be used at the right time and in the right place. One wrong invasion, one failed campaign could break the British war effort for good. Brooke saw his job as making sure that never happened. And this is where the story collides with the Americans. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the alliance between Britain and America became the defining strategic relationship of the conflict. But it was not a smooth partnership. The Americans, particularly General George Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, wanted a direct cross-channel invasion of France as soon as possible. Some American planners were pushing for an invasion as early as 1942. Marshall himself wanted it in 1943. At the latest, the American view was straightforward. Hit the enemy where he is strongest, drive straight for Berlin, and end the war. Brooke thought this was insane, not because a cross-channel invasion was the wrong idea. He agreed completely that the liberation of France and the defeat of Germany in Western Europe was the ultimate goal. But he believed with absolute conviction that doing it too early, before the Allies had enough troops, enough landing craft, enough air superiority, and enough experience in large-scale amphibious operations, would be a disaster that could lose the war. This is the argument that consumed Allied strategy for over 2 years, and Brooke was at the center of it. At conference after conference, at Casablanca, at Washington, at Quebec, at Tehran, Brooke fought for what became known as the Mediterranean strategy. His argument was that before the Allies could invade France, they needed to do several things. They needed to knock Italy out of the war. They needed to draw German divisions away from the Atlantic Wall. They needed to gain practical experience in amphibious operations on a large scale. And they needed to wait until 1944, when the sheer weight of American production would give them overwhelming superiority in men, ships, and aircraft. The Americans resisted this fiercely. They suspected, with some justification, that the British were trying to protect their imperial interests in the Mediterranean. They thought Brooke was being overly cautious, too focused on avoiding failure rather than pursuing victory. The arguments at the combined Chiefs of Staff meetings were sometimes brutal. Brooke's diaries record sessions where he clashed directly with Marshall, with the American Admiral Ernest King, who openly disliked the British and wanted to prioritize the Pacific War, and with other senior American commanders who thought the whole Mediterranean approach was a British stalling tactic. The Casablanca Conference in January of 1943 was one of the most contentious. Brooke arrived with a detailed strategic brief and spent days arguing his case against American resistance. The atmosphere in those rooms was nothing like the smiling photographs that were released to the press. Behind closed doors, Allied officers were fighting each other almost as hard as they were fighting the Germans. Brooke found the Americans frustrating. The Americans found Brooke arrogant. Both sides thought the other was dangerously wrong, but Brooke won the argument, not through charm or persuasion, because he had very little of either. He won it through relentless, grinding logic. He marshaled the facts, presented the numbers, laid out the shipping calculations and the divisional strengths, and demonstrated again and again that a premature invasion of France would fail. The North Africa campaign happened, the invasion of Sicily happened, the invasion of Italy happened. Each one built the skills, the logistics, and the combat experience that the Allied forces would need when they finally crossed the English Channel. And when D-Day finally came in June of 1944, it worked. Not easily, not without terrible casualties, but it worked, in part because it happened at the moment when the Allies were ready, not a year earlier when they were not. Brooke deserves more credit for that timing than almost anyone else. He was the man who held the line against premature action, who absorbed the political pressure from Churchill and the strategic pressure from the Americans, and who insisted that the invasion happen only when the conditions were right, which makes what happened next all the more painful. For years, Brooke had been led to believe that when the cross-channel invasion finally came, he would command it. Churchill had promised him the role. It was to be the crowning achievement of his career, the moment when all of his strategic planning, all of his arguments, all of his late-night battles with Churchill would culminate in personal command of the greatest military operation in history. Then Churchill took it away from him. The political reality was that by 1943, the United States was contributing far more troops and resources to the war than Britain. It was simply not sustainable for a British general to command an operation where the majority of forces were American. Churchill told Brooke the command would go to an American. It went to Eisenhower. Brooke's diary entry for that day is one of the most quietly devastating passages in any memoir of the war. He wrote about the disappointment with a restraint that somehow makes it worse. He did not rage. He did not throw things. He accepted it with the discipline of a professional soldier, even though something inside him clearly broke a little. He had spent years doing the invisible work, the unglamorous work, the work of strategic argument and institutional management, with the private hope that one day he would step onto the stage himself. And when the moment came, the stage was given to someone else. He kept working. He kept managing Churchill. He kept chairing the chiefs of staff meetings. He kept doing the job with the same meticulous discipline he had brought to artillery calculations on the Western Front 30 years earlier, because the war was not over and the job still needed doing. The Allied advance through France. The arguments over broad front versus narrow front strategy. The crisis of the Ardennes offensive. The final push into Germany. Brooke was involved in all of it, but always from behind the scenes, always as the man in the office rather than the man in the field. When the war ended in 1945, the world celebrated the commanders whose names it knew. Montgomery got a viscountcy and a victory parade. Eisenhower became the most famous general on earth and eventually President of the United States. Patton became a legend, partly because of a movie. Even lesser-known generals got their share of public recognition. Brooke got a title. He became Viscount Alan Brooke. He retired to his country estate in Hampshire and returned to the two loves of his pre-war life, birdwatching and fishing. He spent his final years in quiet obscurity, watching birds in the English countryside, while the world remembered the war through the stories of other men. His diaries were published posthumously, edited by the military historian Arthur Bryant, first in 1957, and then in a more complete edition in 1959. They caused a sensation among those who read them. For the first time, the public got a glimpse of what the war had really looked like from the inside, the exhaustion, the arguments, the near disasters that never made it into the official histories. The diaries revealed a Churchill that the public had never seen. Not the bulldog spirit of the speeches, but a difficult, demanding, sometimes irrational man who had to be managed as carefully as any battlefield opponent. Some Churchill loyalists were furious. They accused Brooke of disloyalty, of tarnishing the great man's reputation. Others recognized the diaries for what they were, an honest account by a man who admired Churchill enormously but refused to pretend that admiration meant agreement. But diaries are not movies. They do not create legends. And by the time Brooke's account of the war reached the public, the mythology had already been written. There was no room for a quiet, intense, bird-watching field marshal in a story that was already full of larger-than-life characters. The war had been packaged into a narrative of bold leaders and decisive battles, and Brooke fit into none of those categories, and that is perhaps the deepest irony of Brooke's story. The very qualities that made him so effective are the same qualities that made him so forgettable. He was not charismatic. He was not quotable. He did not crave the spotlight. He was a man who believed that the job mattered more than the credit, that being right mattered more than being remembered, that the careful, methodical, exhausting work of strategy was more important than the dramatic gesture. He was right about all of that. But history has a way of rewarding the dramatic gesture anyway. Consider what would have happened without Brooke. If Churchill's wilder schemes had gone ahead, British forces could have been scattered across Norway, the Aegean, and Southeast Asia, frittered away in secondary theatres while the decisive battle in France went unfought. Churchill genuinely wanted to invade the island of Rhodes at one point. He wanted to send forces into the Balkans. He kept coming back to Norway, again and again, convinced that a northern operation would be decisive. Each of these ideas, taken individually, had a certain seductive logic. Taken together, they would have bled the British Army dry before the real fight even started. And if the Americans had gotten their way and launched a cross-channel invasion in 1942 or 43, before the Allies had enough landing craft, enough trained divisions, or enough air superiority, the invasion could have failed. The disaster at Dieppe in August of 1942, where a raid on the French coast resulted in over 60% casualties among the attacking Canadian and British forces, gave a bitter preview of what a premature invasion would look like. A failed D-Day would not have just been a setback. It could have prolonged the war by years. It could have given Germany time to deploy new weapons, including jet fighters and the advanced submarines that were already in development. It could have shattered the Anglo-American alliance at the very moment it was most needed. Brooke prevented all of that, not with speeches or medals or dramatic confrontations, but with logistics reports and shipping calculations and the sheer stubborn persistence of a man who knew he was right and refused to back down even when the Prime Minister of Great Britain was shouting at him at 2 in the morning. Brooke died in 1963 at the age of 79, having outlived most of the men he had argued with and worked alongside during the war. His grave is in the churchyard of St. Mary the Virgin in Hartley-Wintney, Hampshire. It does not attract tourists. There are no statues of him in prominent London squares. No major films tell his story. He exists in the footnotes of the war, mentioned in passing by historians who understand his importance, but never quite managing to break through into public awareness. The men who became famous from World War II were, for the most part, men who commanded in the field. They led armies, captured cities, accepted surrenders. Their stories had clear narrative arcs with beginnings, middles, and ends. Brooke's story does not have that shape. His story is about what he prevented, not what he achieved. It is about the disasters that did not happen because he was in the room. It is about the decisions that were never made because he argued against them until Churchill gave up. That is an almost impossible kind of achievement to dramatize. But maybe that is exactly why his story matters. Because every war, every crisis, every great endeavor in history has people like Brooke. People who do the work that nobody sees. People who make the right decisions in rooms where nobody is watching. People who absorb the pressure and the frustration and the lack of recognition because they know the work is more important than the glory. Alan Brooke ran Britain's war. He managed the most difficult political leader of the 20th century. He shaped the grand strategy that defeated Nazi Germany. He sacrificed the command he had earned and kept working anyway. And then he went home, picked up his binoculars, and spent his final years watching birds. The generals who get remembered are the ones who charged forward. The one who mattered most was the one who knew when to hold back. If you found this story worth hearing, hit subscribe and leave a comment telling us which forgotten figure from history you think deserves their own video. And if you enjoyed this, drop a like so more people can find it.